Welcome to this month's edition of the College in Arts and Sciences Seminar Series. It's been a great series of events so far this year. I'm grateful to Dean Nelson for the support in making this program happen. This talk is a collaboration with the Humanity and Technology Lecture Series, which has, I think now we're actually in our 5th year of that series, which was it's co-organized by myself and Dr. Delogu. Now we bring in a speaker one speaker a semester to talk about technology from a humanistic perspective. Our tagline for that particular series is "The World We Make and What It Means." So it was a really nice synergy between humanity and technology and the College of Arts and Sciences seminar theme this year of experimental curiosity. So that's what's going to bring us our today's speaker. Before I say a few words about him, I want to announce our next event. So on Thursday, February 29th, the Department of Natural Sciences will be hosting Dr. Jamie Wilbur, Assistant Professor in the Department of Plant, Soil, and Microbial Sciences at Michigan State. So they will be here to join us. So please mark your calendars and make sure that you come out for that event. And as always, we serve pizza. So if you feed them, they will come. So make sure you come for that. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Dmitri Brown. Dr. Brown is a postdoctoral scholar in the University of Michigan Society of Fellows and an assistant professor in the Department of American Culture. His current book project, tentatively titled Tunnel to the Sun, Tewa Stories of Physics and Modernity, explores Pueblo accommodations to modern incursions in northern New Mexico. It focuses on the relationship between the Manhattan Project headquarters at Los Alamos and the surrounding Tewa Pueblo indigenous communities. The work develops a dialogue between Tewa philosophers and atomic physicists. And I'm going to go off script here to say that I've had the distinct pleasure of reading an early chapter of this work. And I would say that it not only documents and explores this relationship between Tewa philosophy and atomic physics, but it actually performs the kind of intersectional thinking in its own writing of that work. So I think this is going to be a really groundbreaking project, and I'm very, very excited to see it come out into the world, and really excited that we have the pleasure of getting a kind of preview of that thought in today's talk. Dmitri's research has been supported by numerous organizations, including the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Ford Foundation, and a Mellon ACLS Fellowship. He has contributed to a range of Tewa Pueblo community-based research, publications, and grant projects, especially in Santa Clara Pueblo, where his family is from. And his talk today is entitled, Give It Back to the Indians, Commemoration and Place in Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brown. Thanks, Dmitri.
Hi, everyone. It's an honor and really a treat to get to be here with you all today. I want to especially thank Paul. I was looking for him for a second. Thank Paul for thinking of me and inviting me and for that kind introduction. I'm grateful to LTU and the organizers of this event. Grateful to you all for showing up and showing interest in the topic today. In my presentation, I'd like to take you to the American Southwest, to the mountains and mesas and the high desert of northern New Mexico, to the blue skies. I'd like to introduce you to my grandmother and to other Tewa Pueblo elders whose memories, experiences, and thoughts shed light on the Manhattan Project and the birth of the atomic age in perhaps unexpected ways. The Manhattan Project took place in the Tewa world, a geographic and spiritual zone defined by mountains and centered in the plazas of indigenous Pueblo villages. In my larger writing project, I'm trying to figure out what it means that the Manhattan Project took place here. Before we focus on the Tewa world, I want to start with a bigger, flashier image that's international and global in scope. And that image is the new Oppenheimer film. It was in a casual conversation with Paul, actually, that this idea first sprang to mind. I think he was maybe considering inviting me to give a lecture and half jokingly asked if I would mention the movie if I gave a talk. So I think I took that idea and ran with it full steam ahead. Film critique is a new terrain for me, and you'll be able to tell that I'm still developing and working through some of the ideas here, so I appreciate your willingness to listen and bear with me. Many of you, I imagine, went to theaters and saw the 3-hour movie, or perhaps you only saw the trailers, or maybe you just overheard somebody mention the Barbenheimer phenomenon and wondered what that was. You might have read American Prometheus, the biography by Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin that the film adapts. In any case, you probably are aware, to some degree, if you're here today, that Christopher Nolan came out with a new movie called Oppenheimer that received a ton of publicity, a ton of revenue, and mostly positive feedback. Thinking of folks in the room or imagining the interests of folks in this room, I think the film has intellectual resonance beyond its aesthetic or entertainment value. It's safe to say that the film raises questions about the relationship between technology and humanity, technology and science, technology and war, technology and historical narrative. It's also a film that has a lot to do with the lecture series theme of experimental curiosity, which I love as an organizing concept, by the way. Sorry. I skipped 2 slides, I think. We might interpret some of the risks and strategies that Christopher Nolan took as a filmmaker as examples of experimental curiosity. I don't necessarily have the technical vocabulary, but I'm thinking of the IMAX film size, the lack of computer visual effects, his play with color and perspective and imagery. I'm thinking of his attempt to actually visualize an atom and the energy within an atom. When we look at the historical subject of the film, the story of the Manhattan Project and Robert Oppenheimer's life and the development of quantum physics that made nuclear weapons practically feasible, the idea of experimental curiosity is inescapable. I'm neither a physicist nor a filmmaker. I'm a historian with a special interest in Native and Indigenous studies, but I have some questions that I want to address through an analytical reading of this film, and those questions also, I think, reflect the idea of experimental curiosity. The questions that drive my larger research project have shifted over the years, and they're starting to become framed as a series beginning with, what happens when we, ... For example, what happens when we imagine Tewa Pueblo scholars in dialogue with atomic physicists? What happens when we place Tewa cosmology and quantum mechanics side by side? These types of questions, what happens when we emerge from a framework of mutual complicity and collective creativity? Those are complex word pairings that probably be unpacked, but perhaps more simply I can just say that that framework, what happens when we, also derives from a sense of experimental curiosity on my part within my specific discipline of history. To explain this idea a bit further, I was reading one of award-winning historian Taya Miles' books when I first encountered the idea that the questions historians ask change and develop over time. Of course, everything changes over time. That's the whole idea of history. But Miles points out that historians of her generation concerned with slavery and Native history moved from questions of what, when, and where to questions of why and how, and that they were moving towards questions of what does it mean that, ... So for me to take up the question framework, what happens when we, isn't necessarily advancing an entire discipline or field, but it's an experimental proposition driven by a curiosity about how we can bring old sources together to tell new stories. I want to acknowledge that this, sorry, I keep on messing myself up with the PowerPoint slide. I want to acknowledge that this framework is something that Native scholars and Native historians have been working with for decades in various areas, and I think it holds great potential, which is why I'm spending so much time in this introductory segment exploring the idea. That idea generally is what happens when we reevaluate, say, US history through Native American perspectives. This is the major thrust of Ned Blackhawk's recent National Book Prize award-winning text, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples, and the Unmaking of US History. There are also a number of works that take up a similar premise, but from a more tribal or regional context. One example is William Bower's book, California Through Native Eyes, Reclaiming History. Borrowing Bower's turn of phrase, I want to offer a viewing of Oppenheimer through Pueblo eyes. The last comment I want to give about this question frame, what happens when we, is that it's a useful way to push the boundaries of what we know, what we can know, and how we go about the process of knowing. In this way, it resonates both with ideas expressed by atomic physicists and Pueblo philosophers. To take one example or develop one example, I want to read a portion of something Richard Feynman wrote. Some of you may be familiar with that name. He was a very famous physicist, Nobel Prize winner in 1965, and a key member in the theoretical physics division of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. In the particular passage I want to cite, Feynman was writing about the relationship between physics and mathematics, describing how the two disciplines created lines of reasoning for the other to follow, passing them back and forth in a productive exchange. He's describing this interaction, and then he seems to take a step back to consider knowledge production in a more general sense. He writes, quote, "Everybody who reasons carefully about anything is making a contribution to the knowledge of what happens when you think about something." I like this a lot because the emphasis is on the creative act of thinking and reasoning rather than on seeking some objective truth with a capital T. Again, quote, "Everybody who reasons carefully about anything is making a contribution to the knowledge of what happens when you think about something." There aren't very many famous or well-known table philosophers per se, but I want to share an often cited, as often as possible cited, line from one table philosopher here to give you an example of the types of correlations that have been percolating in my work. Santa Clara Pueblo scholar Rena Swenzel, who is also the grandmother I said I wanted to introduce you to, writes, quote, "Truth is not absolute in the Pueblo world. There is never one truth. The world, the cosmos, the whole, is multifaceted and expresses many truths at once. Simultaneous levels of existence, as told in the Pueblo emergent stories, are a part of daily reality and understanding. Wholes, the cosmos, the community, are what must be experienced because parts, which can be wholes in their own context, give only a partial sense of understanding. There is, then, no set truth because contexts always change given any particular stance or reality. Because wholes are ever-changing, the effort to perceive wholes is unending, therefore absolute truth is never attained." And if I might add one more quote to this mixture of thought and perspective and context and truths, this is what the man of the hour, Robert Oppenheimer himself, had to say about the philosophical and physical principle of complementarity, which was key to understanding the strange developments and implications of quantum physics at the time. Quote, One of the first things that the student of atomic structure must come to understand is the principle of complementarity, which recognizes that various ways of talking about physical experience may each have validity and may each be a necessary and adequate description of the physical world, and may yet stand in a mutually contradictory relationship to each other. What I find in each of these quotations is an invitation to place disparate worldviews or the seemingly disparate perspectives of table philosophers and atomic physicists in conversation with each other, and then to find out what happens. So with that, let's go to the movies. Before getting our popcorn, though, and finding our seats, there's a few things we should know. A few things we might remember as we're walking into the theater. This is a film that's going to cover, at least in part, the story of Los Alamos and the development of atomic weapons there. Los Alamos is a 10 to 15 minute drive up a winding mesa road from the nearest pueblos. The table pueblos of San Ildefonso and Santa Clara, where my family is from and where most of my research is located and focused. During the Manhattan Project, many young men from the pueblos went overseas to fight in the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. Many of those who remained in the pueblos found jobs in construction or as janitors and cafeteria workers at Los Alamos. Seasonally, as many as 100 maids, 100 women from the nearby pueblos went to Los Alamos for work as maids, carried by military buses. Los Alamos sits on a mesa filled with ancestral Puebloan sites, sites with which Pueblo people to this day maintain deep connections. There are a ton of concerns now about the environmental and health impacts of Los Alamos on its surroundings. People wonder about radioactive elk meat and the waste that seeps through the watersheds into food and into bodies. But people also sustain themselves and their families with jobs at Los Alamos. Over the decades, Pueblo people rose from the ranks of maids and janitors to become laboratory employees, scientists, and engineers. And many experienced this employment pattern with the feeling of achievement and accomplishment. During the Manhattan Project, Pueblo people played understated but important roles at Los Alamos. Los Alamos in turn brought economic, social, environmental, and cultural change to the Pueblos. We, and I mean that in an inclusive sense, don't necessarily expect to see Pueblo representation in Nolan's Oppenheimer, but it wouldn't be surprising either. A TV series from a decade ago called Manhattan, which dramatizes the same subject, did include Tewa Pueblo maids, hanging clothes and carrying children. So perhaps we'd expect something like that in the background. Turns out we don't get that, but I want to run through what we do get in Nolan's Oppenheimer. Anything we get that has anything to do with the Tewa Pueblos, however remotely or tangentially. I'm going to include the notion of place here in this viewing summary. And this inclusion of place comes from ideas widespread among indigenous studies scholars. Place is of paramount importance. It is often considered in relation to, and in some cases more important than, time in indigenous worldviews and self-conceptions. Place is an English approximation for something that many native groups consider to be a living being, a whole being. In the Tewa language, the Los Alamos Mesa is known as Tzire e Akono, or Meadow of the Little Birds. It has significance in the cosmology of the Tewa world between the village plazas in the valley and the surrounding mountaintops. In many ways, and this is something we might be able to see from both indigenous and non-indigenous perspectives, place plays an active yet uncredited role in the story of the Manhattan Project, even in Nolan's version of it. So in the film, our first concrete mention of New Mexico comes after the scene in which Oppenheimer attends a lecture by Werner Heisenberg with his friend Isidore Rabi. Heisenberg invites Oppenheimer to publish something in collaboration, but Oppenheimer declines, explaining he needs to go back to America. When Heisenberg asks why and says that no one cares about quantum mechanics in America, Robbie steps in to explain that Oppenheimer misses the canyons of Manhattan. Oppenheimer corrects Robbie, the canyons of New Mexico, and explains that he has a cabin near Santa Fe. Also, quote, "It's the America I miss right now." I use the phrase first concrete mention of New Mexico because there are quick dream sequences in the early part of the film that flash between abstract atomic representations and Oppenheimer staring at a fire in the dark next to a horse, and that's probably New Mexico too. I also want to apologize in advance for the quality of these images. They're the best I've got given my personal technological know-how. After the conversation with Heisenberg, the film doesn't take us to New Mexico right away. Instead, we go to Berkeley to meet other key characters, including experimental physicist Ernest Lawrence, literature professor Hakon Chevalier, and Oppenheimer's lover Jean Tatlock. The final scene in Berkeley is a sex scene between Oppenheimer and Tatlock. Tatlock pulls a Sanskrit book from Oppenheimer's shelf, gets on top of it, holds the book in front of her breast, and asks him to read a line. Oppenheimer translates it, quote, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." End scene. And now we're in New Mexico. It's dusk. It's possible the audience doesn't know we're in New Mexico now because the conversation with Heisenberg happened a full 8 minutes ago, and a lot has happened since then. But if you're from New Mexico, you know this is New Mexico. There's no dialogue, all we hear is wind, and slowly we start to make out horse riders among the juniper and pinon trees on a hill. An eerie violin theme plays, and then we hear thunder, and then the sounds of horses walking. The first line of dialogue is Oppenheimer, and he says simply, "This'll do." This is a horseback camping trip, and Oppenheimer, his brother Frank, and his Berkeley colleague Ernest Lawrence are together. Lawrence goes out to look at the stars later at night and says, "It's special here," to Oppenheimer, who replies, "When I was a kid, I thought if I could find a way to combine physics and New Mexico, my life would be perfect." Lawrence comments, "Little remote for that." Oppenheimer agrees. That word remote echoes in my head. I have heard the northern New Mexico site of the Manhattan Project described as remote over and over and over. Middle of nowhere is a phrase often used as well. But this is a vibrant place. I know it is. It is teeming with life and activity and history, spirits too, but I know those aren't always apparent to everyone. Remote seems to me a skewed characterization, but I'll leave it there for now. The conversation between Lawrence and Oppenheimer is not over. Oppenheimer says, quote, "The mesa we saw today, one of my favorite places in the world. Tomorrow we'll climb it." "What's it called?" Lawrence asks. Oppenheimer answers, "Los Alamos." Scene ends, and we're back to Berkeley. First, some major historical developments. Fission is discovered. The Nazis invade Poland. Oppenheimer meets his wife, Kitty. And then we're back in New Mexico. Almost same spot, but Oppenheimer is with Kitty this time. They sit and stare across the landscape. Kitty tells the story of her ex-husband and then says, "Now here I am, wherever the hell this is." And Oppenheimer embraces and kisses her. Christopher Nolan thus far has painted northern New Mexico as remote, as special, as seemingly far from worldly concerns and scientific developments. The title of his landscape portrait could borrow from Kitty's dialogue, "Wherever the hell this is." Some of those connotations, though, are about to change. In Oppenheimer's first meeting with General Groves, the Manhattan Project military director, he draws a matrix map of sorts on a chalkboard. R for Rad Lab, M for Met Lab, H for Hanford, T for Tennessee. He explains that each of these Manhattan Project sites are connected by rail, drawing an X to connect them, and then circles the center. Quote, focused on one goal, one point in space and time. It comes together here, a secret laboratory in the middle of nowhere. Oppenheimer's pitch to Groves happens over a montage of workers rolling out barbed wire and scenes of the town's construction. He's explaining to Groves why it's important to let scientists bring their families when we see, for less than a second, a man screwing a barbershop detail on the side of a building. He has long, dark hair, his braids are tucked into his shirt, and he's the first hint in the film of a native or Pueblo presence. If we don't let scientists bring their families, Oppenheimer says, we'll never get the best. If you want security, build a town. Build it fast. Where? Groves asks. The music gets dramatic, and it opens onto a flat landscape that, to anyone who knows New Mexico, is not Los Alamos. Welcome to Los Alamos, Oppenheimer says. And then he explains to Groves, this is our next hint of Indian presence, quote, there's a boys' school we'll have to commandeer, and the local Indians come up here for burial rites. But apart from that, nothing. 40 miles, any direction. Remote comes back to my mind. According to Nolan's Oppenheimer, local Indians come up here for burial rites, and yet it's in the middle of nowhere. I'm sure Christopher Nolan visited the real Los Alamos. It would be too egregious an oversight if he did not. Yet, he does not seem to mind that the place he decided to film as a substitute for Los Alamos does not really resemble the mountainside mesa on which Los Alamos sits. Many scholars of nuclear colonialism have pointed out the historical and rhetorical process of wastelanding, by which certain places are deemed unworthy of care, certain places are deemed appropriate sacrifice zones. The idea of remoteness in the film is starting to resemble, for me, what these scholars describe through the wastelanding concept, though in a way that is mediated through representation or represented through media. For Nolan, it's clear it doesn't really matter where Los Alamos is. He's found a good spot to film. That's good enough and close enough. And after all, it's the middle of nowhere. I have a sort of meta commentary in the back of my mind too, though, that I'm concerned this is a petty critique on my part, or comes across as a petty critique. After all, Cillian Murphy is not exactly Oppenheimer, and Matt Damon is not exactly General Groves. At the same time, I feel uneasy about the out-of-placeness of the film. Something only perhaps the most familiar with New Mexico and most critical would catch. This place, the place he chose to film, is too far north, and the rocks don't look right. Either way, we can come back to the issue later, returning for the moment to the film's narrative. I'm hoping this next part doesn't need a spoiler alert, but spoiler alert, the bombs designed in Los Alamos do work, both in a test in southern central New Mexico, the Trinity test, and in Japan to end the war. At 2 hours and 5 minutes into the film, and we're still an hour or so from the end, Oppenheimer walks into a cheering auditorium in Los Alamos, a celebration of the successful bombing of Japan. In this scene, Oppenheimer's entire psyche seems to be crushing, imploding under the weight of his conscience, under the weight of what he imagines his creation must have done to Japanese bodies. He walks toward the podium, turns to face the crowd, and forces a smile. Behind him, there is a fireplace and a stone wall. On the mantel, there's a black pot we glimpse for a second. The pot is almost certainly one of the many pieces of pottery from the pueblos of Santa Clara and San Ildefonso that physicists and their wives used to decorate their homes. It is characteristic of the so-called black-on-black pieces that the two pueblos are famous for. I have no idea how it made it into this film and with what degree of consciousness it was placed there on the set, though it seems pretty intentional. The pots do show up in historical photographs, and they are the subject of one of the two sentences that Richard Rhodes devotes to the Pueblos in his book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb. The symbolism is ripe in this scene. There are two American flags sticking out of the pot. The pot is behind Oppenheimer while he speaks, and it is out of focus, coming straight out of the back of his head. After his speech, he walks forward and steps on what we might consider an inverted image or perversion, perhaps, of this pot, a charred, hollow corpse representing the effect of his bomb. The juxtaposition between the pot and the body is striking. There is a degree of effective or provocative understatement here. We have an out-of-focus pot and a shocking but only briefly glimpsed blackened, charred body. This scene does a lot of work for Nolan. It carries a lot of weight, but it is also so brief. This one scene might be the most important in the entire movie, especially considered in the global historical context of the moment it's about. I worry, as a historian, as someone who cares about this history, that it is too fleeting, perhaps, for its significance to register in audiences' minds. The next scene is a meeting between Oppenheimer and Truman, and President Truman. And this is the final mention of Los Alamos, New Mexico, and Indians in the film. Truman says, "I hear you're leaving Los Alamos. What should we do with it?" Oppenheimer says, "Give it back to the Indians." That's not what happened to Los Alamos. It functioned throughout the Cold War, designing increasingly powerful nuclear weapons. Today, it serves as a scientific laboratory, advancing research in medicine and climate change or climate resilience, things that hold more positive connotations, but also still nuclear weapons for the sake of national security. Reflecting on the film, what can we say about it? Oppenheimer is based on history, clearly, but Nolan, understandably and rightfully perhaps, takes creative license with many aspects. It's not my intention to go through what's accurate and what's not. Nolan sets out to tell a story, so to say what he got right or wrong according to historical evidence seems beside the point. What Nolan's film is doing, and this is related to history, is commemorating Oppenheimer and the Manhattan Project. This is an important word for me, and I want to dwell on this idea. Nolan's film is not history, it is a commemoration, or a calling to our collective minds. That point was underscored in press about the film and in Nolan's interviews. Many journals have quoted his production notes in which he writes, quote, "Oppenheimer is the most important person who ever lived." When pressed on this comment by a New York Times interviewer, Nolan responded, "Do I genuinely believe it? Absolutely. Because if my worst fears are true, he'll be the man who destroyed the world. Who's more important than that? For better or for worse, I really believe him to be one of the most clearly ambiguous figures in history." There's a paradox in that idea of the most clearly ambiguous, and that description doesn't exactly parallel the idea of most important either. In the same interview, Nolan explains, quote, "I think Oppenheimer's ambition exceeded his intellect," and, quote, "he was in the top, but not the actual top." Oppenheimer was charming and a leader of men, able to orchestrate a vast number of ideas and personalities. And here the interviewer picks up on what I think is an important aspect of the film, asking, "Is that like what a movie director does? You corralled an enormous number of top actors for this movie." Nolan doesn't say yes, but he explains that he brought an array of talented people together and emphasizes what each actor brought to the table and their own individual research into each of the characters. So the subtext is yes, in so many words, implying that Oppenheimer and Nolan have similar strengths as directors. Nolan says, quote, The film is my interpretation of his life. I wanted it to be a strong interpretation, a very personal interpretation. I didn't want to make a documentary. Through these interview excerpts, we begin to understand how Oppenheimer is as much, if not maybe more, about Christopher Nolan than it is about Oppenheimer, the historical figure. I think this is important, but it's an idea that can get lost in the themes and the drama and the imagery of the story. Developing the point, though, I've already suggested that Nolan may see his role and skill as director as parallel to Oppenheimer's. They both had the ability to lead talented people to create something larger than themselves. Nolan's sense that Oppenheimer's ambition exceeded his intellect is also something that echoes in Nolan's self-critique. In another interview, he explains that, quote, "Your biggest hindrance as a screenwriter is authority, is knowledge. I'm not a scientist. I have no way to become a scientist in the period of time it would take me to write a script. You look to experts and expert knowledge." The movie is an adaptation of Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's authoritative and well-researched account of Oppenheimer, and Nolan also worked with several physicists to hammer out scientific details of the film. Nolan recognized the limits of his intellect, in other words, but pursued his ambition to produce the film. He sees himself as the person to tell this story. Nolan reminds us that Oppenheimer was neither the best mathematician nor the best physicist, but that his charisma brought experts together. To add a minor note to the point I'm developing here, I want to repeat what Nolan says, that Oppenheimer, quote, "was in the top, but not the actual top." Oppenheimer, you may know, never won a Nobel Prize. Nolan, you may also know, has not yet brought home an Oscar for Best Director or Best Picture, though that could change in the coming months. In many ways, I think Nolan was correct when, in an interview, he says that Oppenheimer, quote, "is the ultimate Rorschach test." Nolan explains, quote, "I believe you see in the Oppenheimer story that this is I believe you see in the Oppenheimer story all that is great and all that is terrible about America's uniquely modern power in the world." I would only push here to expand the Rorschach metaphor. Nolan imagines himself holding up the ink blot for the audience to interpret. But I think it's also fair to see the audience as administering the test. Nolan is the subject, and the history of the Manhattan Project and Oppenheimer and the security clearance hearing is the ink blot. And Nolan admits, quote, "the audience finishes the film. When the film goes out in cinemas, that's when the film is done and it becomes what it's going to be in the culture." There's an echo here too, in a way, in what the bomb meant to world history. Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr, and other physicists hoped that its sheer destructive capacity would mean that war itself was no longer feasible, that it would no longer be a valid policy option. At its inception, the bomb meant and could have meant many things, and in some ways it still does. As Nolan explains, quote, "My goal when making the film, I don't make films to send a message, I made it because it's a fascinating story. Part of that storytelling is getting back to basics about the bomb, stripping away policy statements, philosophy, the geopolitical situation, and just looking at the raw power that's about to be unleashed and what that means for the people involved and means for all of us." The film turned out to be a massive blockbuster hit, grossing over $950 million. It's difficult to speak for audiences at large, why people go see a movie and what they think about it, though it tends to be reviewed relatively well, earning over 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. In large part, serious critics and reviewers of the film attest to the commemorative aspects of Oppenheimer. NPR film critic Bob Mondello calls Oppenheimer, quote, "a monument to science and the arrogance of genius." Many comment on the real-world relevance of the film. They see it as an invitation to widen the lens of conversation and consider various aspects of nuclear weapons and the nuclear industry. Several reviewers bring up historical gaps in the film. For example, where are the downwinders of nuclear tests and the Japanese bomb victims? And they argue about how fairly or accurately the film portrays the subject material. Some asked how the film confronts the threat of nuclear weapons and how it raises public awareness. Lovely Umayam, a nuclear nonproliferation advocate, calls the film a, quote, abbreviated history lesson. Many reviewers see the film's relevance to technological circumstances beyond nuclear realms. What can the film tell us about AI, for example? Interesting, perhaps, that Elon Musk and Sam Altman are among those who did not care for the film. I don't want to generalize based on Musk and Altman and suggest that only tech bro megalomaniacs don't like the film. There are plenty of thoughtful people who were bored by it or hoped the film would do more than it did or hoped it would emphasize certain aspects of the story. Altman's comment, though, quote, "I was hoping that the Oppenheimer movie would inspire a generation of kids to be physicists, but it really missed the mark on that," does, though, reflect a wider pattern among film reviewers that see the film as a portrayal of science and scientists in general, as people with specific roles and responsibilities in society. About 2 decades ago, historian Catherine Carson wrote, quote, "A good dramatic story, Oppenheimer's life has attracted commentators of every sort. Their accounts have become overlaid in historical memory, leading to an unusually dense complex of interpretations with which today's analysts have to contend. Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer provides a certain popular focal point in this dense field of representation. Given these questions of overlaid historical memory, varied interpretations, and commemoration, I'm interested in the idea of who is telling the story and who the story is for. As I argued or pointed out, Christopher Nolan sees himself as the person to tell this story. But I'm also reminded of a line from a review by Alicia Inez Guzman that focuses on New Mexicans. Quote, "Oppenheimer bound us to the bomb," she writes. Quote, "His story is our story." The social and environmental justice organization, Tewa Women United, asks that if we choose to see the film, to please also consider the other side of the story. That is, the Tewa perspectives, the downwinders perspectives, the Japanese perspectives, the wives and children's perspectives. There are many, many points of view that stand on the other side of this narrative. In Tewa Pueblo culture, as Tewa scholars and writers have noted, there is great wisdom and power in things left unsaid, in unspoken things and in silence. There's a knowledge we all carry about the dark mystery of the universe, but even to say that, to speak that, to put that in words shatters the meaning and removes us from it or me from it. This unspoken quality might even be at play in the silences and absences of Pueblo people in Nolan's Oppenheimer. Silence and absence are powerful. They do communicate, but in a perhaps paradoxical sense, they seem to be more powerful when we know they are actually there. Think back to the scene where Oppenheimer references Indian burial rites. At almost that same time in history, in 1943, just a few months after Oppenheimer and Groves began to build their secret laboratory town, Pueblo leaders were in Washington, D.C., protesting the exploration of dam sites in the area. They did not want dams, and they did not want the Bureau of Reclamation to dig anywhere on their land, even if the purpose of digging was to prove that a dam site was not feasible. When pressed by congressmen why they would not agree to a dam site exploration, even in a highly localized, contained sense, one Pueblo leader explained that their ancestors had been buried on that land for hundreds and thousands of years. They had become dust and part of the land, and there was no possible way of knowing exactly where they were. This inability to know with precision held all of the land then as sacred. It was therefore inappropriate to dig or disturb any part of it. At the beginning of this presentation, I quoted Oppenheimer defining complementarity. Quote, "Various ways of talking about physical experience may each have validity and may each be a necessary and adequate description of the physical world and may yet stand in a mutually contradictory relationship to each other." The middle of nowhere, as Nolan's Oppenheimer put it, may also be the middle of everywhere. To conclude, I'd just like to share my hope that the silences in the film can be heard and can resonate as loudly as the raw power of the bomb that captured the imagination of the film's director. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. That was fantastic. So many things to think about. Let's start with some questions. We've got a couple back here. And if you can just hold off to speak into the mic so we get it for the recording.
Hi, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation. My name is Sabrina Collins. I'm a chemist, but some of my good friends are physicists, so I'll say that. But a couple of things. One comment that you made about who's telling the story, because that absolutely does matter. But with Hollywood, they often do miss the mark when telling the stories of women and people of color, and you see that over and over again. But I wanted your thoughts on this regarding, because I haven't seen the film yet. I do plan to. Stop it. Oppenheimer felt very guilty, right, afterwards. But I wanted your thoughts on this, because the decision to make the bomb and the decision to drop the bomb, those are two different things. So I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The decision to make the bomb, the decision to drop the bomb, two very different decisions. In many ways, the decision to use the bomb once it was made was well in place through the levels of the Army, the levels of bureaucracy that it needed to go through. The idea was that if a bomb was built in time to be used in the war, it was going to be used. And the mechanisms, the legal bureaucratic mechanisms were in place to allow that to happen. The decision to pursue building the bomb in the first place, it carried different meanings at different points along the way, I think. Initially, you see a lot of buy-in because there's the idea that the Nazis are also developing a bomb. The Nazis are ahead of the United States in terms of developing a bomb. Heisenberg's there. Physicists have a lot of catching up to do. Physicists in the United States need to save as much time as possible, need to work as fast and as hard as possible to develop atomic weapons as quickly as possible, because if the Nazis end up with a bomb, game over. That's bad news for everyone. So there's this great desire and a great push. But once the Nazis are out of the war, and it becomes clear that it's only Japan that the bomb could be used against, you begin to see fraying of opinion among the scientists. there's not the same sort of intensity or interest or commitment to develop a bomb if it's going to be used against the Japanese that there was if it was against the Germans. And you do see a little bit, you see some of that story come through in the film itself. There's a petition that the Chicago scientists, the Chicago Met Lab scientists put together so that a bomb might be first demonstrated to show its power, to show its potential, so that it's not used against human beings. It's a sort of winding answer, and I don't know quite how to wrap up, but the idea is that there's changes along the ways in terms of the motivation to build and design and carry out the making of the bomb.
Hello, my name is Franco De Logo. I'm a psychologist here, and I would like to ask you a question, but before I have to do like a small parallel. So I'm from a land that is now part of Italy, and for 10,000 years before becoming part of Italy was kind of very isolated, also genetically. It's Sardinia, it's an island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. Recently, there are uses of the land by, let's say, external to Sardinia kind of populations, especially Italians, like the Italian government, or American military bases that use the land in order to achieve new knowledge in warfare, or even to put like radioactive residuals underground, right? So now Sardinians are very, very much linked to the land, and it's interesting what you said about time and space, right? They are more linked to space, their land, than time. It's like a land without time, right? It's very ancient. There are a lot of these kind of spirals, and they are in between 6,000, 7,000 years old, these kind of things in there. And about all Sardinians, it's like 99%, they are against the use of impoverished uranium bullets in when they do exercitations in war in American and Italian military bases. They are all against the residuals of radioactive residuals underground. And so they see, even if there are clearly good economical perspective in a very poor land, they don't want it. They don't want anything to do with it. They consider actually an invasion and a violation of the land, like a physical violation. So I would like to ask you, on the base also of this parallel, if there is anything similar in the Pueblo population that you mentioned in New Mexico, even because you are actually a person that knows the land because of your relatives lived or live there.
Yeah, in the sense that there is an invasion on the land.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Being negative against what happened there.
Yes. In terms of widely consensus, I can't speak to that, but there are organizations, powerful organizations. Tewa Women United is one that is a group of women who come from the Tewa Pueblos who are very vocal, very strong advocates against Los Alamos for the very reasons that you mentioned, the idea that Los Alamos is an invasion onto this sacred, special place. If you think of the land as a sort of as a mother figure, as a Mother Earth type of figure, which is widespread among the Pueblos, widespread among indigenous communities, perhaps also in Sardinia as well. This idea that you have a military establishment, set there with distinct fences around it and a security system. It's a sort of black hole in a way where knowledge can't come out and certain knowledges can't go in. There's a very dark sense about Los Alamos in general. I would just say that though there are strong organizations like Table Women United who do what they can to push back against Los Alamos, there are a lot of people in Los Alamos who I mentioned in the beginning who have jobs there, who rely on Los Alamos in terms of making a living, who depend on this relationship between Los Alamos and the surrounding communities. So it gets, in terms of thinking practically about what you do and how you have to think about economic and environmental circumstances. The Pueblos also maintain a certain government-to-government relationship with Los Alamos through the Pueblo governments themselves, the tribal councils, and the Department of Energy that runs Los Alamos. They have agreements with each other. So on that level, on the sort of bureaucratic governmental level, there's a relationship that is more complicated, more messy, I think, than a simple invasion and enemy kind of antagonism. Yeah.
Thank you.
More questions? Let's get a physicist in the mix.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I'm Bhuja Bhattacharya. I'm a particle physicist here, so my research is kind of close to what these folks were looking at, of course, half a century in the future. So I want you to comment on sort of power structures in our society that determines narratives of stories, right? So for instance, at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about how a perspective is context dependent, right? So you can have, different people looking at it could see it different ways. And bringing it back to Dr. Collins's question, in fact, that was in the movie where when Oppenheimer goes to President Truman, he points out, he kind of puts Oppenheimer in his place and tells him how, even though he developed the bomb, it was the president's decision on what to do with it, right? And in fact, there's a memorable scene in that where Oppenheimer is leaving the Oval Office and Truman kind of says, "Don't ever let that crybaby into my office." So that kind of tells me about, and in fact, in the future, what happened to Oppenheimer with the sort of the Inquisition that happened, right? So, all of that ties into some sort of a power structure. So if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how specifically I can address your point. Something that comes to mind, though, is that there was perhaps understandably an excitement on the part of the physicists to be working on such a massive project, such an exciting, massive physics project, to have so many great minds, great physics, great chemists in conversation with each other at the same place. You can feel the excitement in their reminiscences. Richard Feynman talks about how wonderful it was to be around so many great men, talking and bouncing ideas off of each other. And so you do, I think, I have, in reading through some of the sources, come away with the sense that what the physicists were developing and building was in a way co-opted by this more powerful military governmental structure. You still, I think, have to reckon with the complicity involved and willingness to take part in the project. But it's not necessarily to say that they're guilty and it was the physicist's fault.
Dmitri, I think we need you to speak in the
Oh, sorry about that. I'll stay over here. Does that maybe gets close to the answer?
I don't have a mic, so.
Okay, thumbs up.
Hi, my name is Matt Cole. I'm the interim dean of the College of Business and Information Technology. I appreciate that you were focusing on very select words to hone in on. They're basically themes in the movie, and I was wondering if you could hone in on ethics. And in business, we teach our students the triple bottom line to help them understand the role of ethics when it comes to people, planet, and profit. And I think in science, and I have a PhD in psychology, so we learn a lot about ethics in conducting human subjects and animal research, for example. But I'm wondering if you honed anything from the movie, or if you want to comment on this notion of ethics in basic science and in physics and things of this nature. And I think that's one of the things that Oppenheimer was totally struggling with, and it's, to me, it's very well expressed in a theatrical way in the movie, his inner challenge with ethics.
Yeah, but thanks for the question. I think that it is, you see his struggle with ethics in, I mean, Cillian Murphy's face is incredibly expressive. The things he says, the way he responds to certain comments, it's absolutely there. You read any of his sources, any of his writings, and you see the way that he struggled, and struggled differently at different times. He didn't have a clear answer, I don't think, and that's sort of the point of the film. And Nolan's comment that he's a clearly ambiguous figure, it's very hard to pin down Oppenheimer and Oppenheimer's ethical perspective. His framework shifts and is constantly responding to the context. I might share a story that is adjacent but not necessarily directly in response to your question. I've been recently struck, I read what a number of these physicists wrote, and some of them are they're very expressive. They can be very fun to read on a philosophical level, and Richard Feynman is one of them. In one of his reminiscences, he's talking about walking through the canyons, these canyons behind that picture there, and he's talking about how this is on Sundays to distract himself from the work at Los Alamos. He would walk through these canyons with his mathematician friend, von Neumann, who may be a familiar name too. And von Neumann tells him this thing one day in their walks through the canyons of New Mexico, that you don't have to be responsible for the world you're in. And Feynman seems to adopt that and really take it to heart and really embraces that idea and really loves this idea. You don't have to be responsible for the world you're in. And I don't think that all the physicists felt that way. It seems like Oppenheimer absolutely felt responsible for the world he was in. You see him grappling and struggling under the weight of his obligations, his responsibilities. I don't have an endpoint to that story. It's just to comment on, I've been thinking about responsibility, trying to understand what the physicists themselves, how they interpreted responsibility and thought about their roles here in relation to the Manhattan Project, but also on a deeper philosophical level too. That's all.
Hi. I'm Julia Kernan, and one of my interests is environmental humanities. And one of the things that I keep thinking about is the narrative or the coming together of the narrative of colonialization and Western education. So when we're thinking about, I come from a place similar to this and similar to Franco's example. So I'm from a small island in Canada that wasn't, it was a colony until 1949. And when it became part of Canada, what we also saw was very soon after that, industry came in and education came in. And I'm just wondering, where do you situate this narrative in terms of colonization or decolonization and the idea of Western education and how those kind of play into each other?
I think what I sort of felt like listening was I was on board, and then I think I may have.
Yeah, no,
mind just
okay,
jumped
sorry.
ship at the
So
last second.
I might not be making any sense because I'm trying to bring this together myself, so it's not just you. But it feels like we come into these remote places, and with them we bring industry, and with them we bring education, and it's not necessarily aligned. Do you know what I mean? It's very like top down. We will do this education here, but we are going to take these people that are potentially, like my province is called a have-not province, and we are going to give them jobs. But never do those two things necessarily align. Like, it's not because they have jobs, then they go on to post-secondary education. We keep these two populations separate. So I'm kind of wondering, is that like a common narrative of colonialization, or does that align at all with the population you're talking about? Like, you did say that some of them moved up to be physicists and work in labs, but was that more of a, a singular type of thing, or like a phenomenon rather than the overall? Like, did we still see people more in kind of blue collar, like working class jobs, and how did that kind of shift?
Yeah, absolutely. We still see more people in blue collar type jobs. I think that it's difficult to establish a straight demographic pattern and sense of employment, but through at least anecdotal records and through other interviews that earlier researchers conducted in the 50s and 60s, there's a distinct sense that Pueblo people who worked at the labs were proud of their jobs, proud to be making money, and were also had the idea that their children, they were providing opportunity for their children then to rise in the ranks, and if they had to work as a janitor, so be it, their child might one day become a physicist or a chemist or an engineer. And that idea seemed to have purchase, seemed to have cultural purchase, economic purchase. I may be misinterpreting your question, but some of the way you were describing the process in Canada reminded me perhaps of where this fits in my overall narrative, the overall story. So I see Los Alamos as one part of a large, much longer history of American incursions, modern American incursions into the Southwest, into the Tewa Pueblo world. And we can really sort of see the start of that with the railroads coming in the 1880s. The railroads come in, boarding schools come in, there are these various logging companies come in. There are these various incursions that come into the Tewa world, and yet that Tewa world remains the Tewa world. It remains whole, we can see it remaining whole, and we can see the various ways that the Tewa Pueblos accommodated, adapted, brought in these incursions and made them their own in a way, made them part of their survival moving forward. And I think it's possible, I think Los Alamos is still on the edge of whether or not and how that fits in the Tewa world. I think Los Alamos will have to change in some fundamental ways in order for it to truly be adapted and embraced in the way that other technologies, other changes, other incursions have been. That includes education too. In many ways, the students, the young Pueblo students who went to school were able to return to the Pueblos and then advocate for Pueblo rights, Tewa rights, land rights in ways that weren't necessarily accessible to them before, ways that they weren't able to before without a sense of Western education or a grounding in Western education.
I want to make sure everyone has a chance to eat some pizza, and I especially want to make sure that students have a chance to interact with Dr. Brown. So he has agreed to be here, so I would ask us all to thank him one last time and then join us in Nest 100 for some pizza and casual conversation. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown.